Hey, how are you?
Oh, we've both been here this morning. How long have you been? Oh, how long have you been waiting this morning?
Just 15 minutes, so it wasn't too bad. I gave him a cookie.
Where's your better half? Parking car. Not right now, what? Hop along. Hey, Clark.
All right, Mike.
See who else we got out here.
I love your teasers, by the way.
Thank you. Hey, Tim, can you hear me?
Carol's here.
Hey, Carol.
Hey, how's everybody doing?
I can only speak for myself. I'm doing well.
Good.
Good.
Hey, Pastor.
Hello. Doing great here, Carol.
Good.
Just heard a ding ding. Somebody should be joining, I would think. Hey, Klaus.
Hi there, how are you?
Great. I saw that Tim is on. Tim, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Awesome. And Rick just joined. Rick is connecting. Hey, Rick. All right, well, I'm going to get going. I sent out, let's see, do this. If you guys see this thing ding at me about somebody coming online, let me know. I sent out an email about this to my normal participants, but the Pope's Forgery, the class that I taught in December, I've turned it into a podcast. Do we have any podcast listeners in here? So if you want to listen to it, it's on all of the major podcast things. And if you're not a podcast person, don't know how to do it, but want to try, send me an email. I'll just send you a link. You can click on it. It'll take you right to, the Spotify page where it is. You can listen. I'm sorry?
I missed that, so missed some of that.
Yeah, send me an email if you want to do, or if you know how to do podcasts. It's just called The Pope's Forgery, and it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the biggies. Okay. Gonna test your knowledge, pre-test. Okay. Which of these pagan gods will you honor this week? All right, who's gonna honor Woden? Nobody? Thor? You gotta have at least one.
Thor has to be a thunderstorm. So
Freya?
Oh, I'll go for Fred.
Okay, Freya? How about Saturn? Fred's gonna honor Saturn and Joe as well. Cheryl, you're not gonna honor any of these?
That's my knowledge.
I don't know that I am. Maybe not.
In Colorado, that you honored these gods.
We all do. On Wednesday, we're gonna honor Woden. On Thursday, we're gonna honor Thor. On Friday, we'll honor Freya.
Saturday.
And on Saturday, we're gonna honor Saturn.
Ooh, it was a trick question.
And on Tuesday, there is a Anglo-Saxon god named Chew. Okay, the pagan, the Anglo-Saxon god of war, right? But every single week, you honor one or more of the pagan gods. And the interesting thing about Chew, okay, the god of war, is that, he was worshipped by the Anglo-Saxons, but we have evidence that Chew was also worshipped by the pre-Christian ancient Mexicans, okay? But he was honored there under the name Taco Tuesday. So that's where Taco Tuesday comes from. Sorry, I had to do it. So the question is, why, centuries after we converted to Christianity, do we still honor the pagan gods in such a fundamental but unwitting way? Okay. And that is really the theme of tonight's episode of Twilight of the Gods. Okay. All right, so we are talking about Anglo-Saxon England, but the story really begins with the Roman province of Britannia. Okay. The Romans were all the way up in Britain, and the green part of this map is what the Romans controlled on the island of Britain. Okay. You can see that they never conquered the extreme north, and they never conquered Ireland. It was always a really far-flung province, and almost kind of the stuff of legend among some of the Romans. In later centuries, there developed a belief that Britain was where the souls of the dead were ferried after a person died. So it really had this kind of mystique about it. But Christianity had taken hold in Britain as it was taking hold in the rest of the Roman Empire. And in fact, there are stories that Britain had very early, and in fact, among the earliest Christian communities. There's a legend that when Jesus was a teenager, before he began his ministry, that his uncle was Joseph of Arimathea. Of course, Joseph of Arimathea is mentioned in the Bible as the guy who provided the money for Jesus's tomb and so forth. Well, the legend was that Joseph was his uncle, and that Joseph was like a merchant, a trader, and he would take teenage Jesus on his trips with him. And one of the trips took them to far-flung Britain, okay? And Jesus preached to the native Britons there near the town of what is now Glastonbury. And in Glastonbury, there is a thorn tree that supposedly Jesus planted, and that he built a church, and there's a little twig church there that is, according to legend, the church that Jesus built. But this tree that is there in Glastonbury, it flowers right around Christmas every year. And every Christmas day, the English royal family gets a flower from this tree on their Christmas table. And it's supposedly the miraculous tree that Jesus planted when he visited there as a teenager. And in the Catholic Church, when they have a procession of the bishops, they go in order of when their bishopric was founded. And the English Church gets to go first because they believe this legend that of all the churches in the world, even before Jerusalem, this church in England was founded by Jesus as a teenager. So Christianity in real life, okay, we know did exist in Roman Britain. It was in all the major cities of the Roman Empire. A famous heresy started in Britain by a guy named Pelagius. Pelagius preached about free will, and he was kind of the arch nemesis of St. Augustine, okay? And a lot of Augustine's writings about predestination and so forth were basically refutations of Pelagius. So we know it was kind of an active Christian community. And if you took my St. Patrick's class last year, you know that St. Patrick lived in Roman Britain and was a Christian there, and he was taken captive by the Irish and made a slave in Ireland. And ultimately, after he escaped Ireland, came back to convert the Irish. But again, more evidence that Christianity was part of the Roman British experience. During the late period of Roman Britain, they started to experience a lot of defensive challenges. They were experiencing raids from really all sides, okay? You've got the Irish raiding from the west, and we just saw Patrick was taken captive by the Irish. We've got the guys in the extreme north of Britain that the Romans never conquered. And the people up there were called the Picts, okay? Which we think is a Latin or Roman word for painted men, because they dyed themselves blue and tattooed themselves all over their body. But these guys were fierce and untamed. And in fact, the Romans eventually got so fed up dealing with these guys that they built a wall that runs from one sea to the other, stretches across that little neck of Britain. That was the Emperor Hadrian built that. So it's called Hadrian's Wall. And if you've ever been to Britain, you could go and walk the length of Hadrian's Wall. Has anybody actually gone and see it?
Yeah.
I want to go see it sometime. So we've got the Picts attacking from the north, we've got the Irish from the west, and from the east, we've got the Saxons coming from basically Germany and Denmark, okay? In 406 AD, you may remember from the fall of the Roman Empire class, the Rhine River froze and all these barbarians from Germany poured into the Roman Empire and chaos ensued. And we had an ambitious general who was up in Roman Britain and decided he was going to take advantage of the situation and become emperor. So his troops declared him emperor. And what he did was then he took most, if not all, of the troops out of Britain to go down into the continent and make his claim to be emperor. So now we have Roman Britain basically left to its own devices, left defenseless as a result of this. And in 410 AD, the Britons in Rome, the Romans in Britain wrote to the emperor and said, things are falling apart here. We need you to send us troops. And we have the letter that the emperor wrote back, basically saying, fend for yourself. I don't have any troops to send you. You are on your own. And so 410 AD is traditionally considered the date when the province of Britain was lost to the Roman Empire. So the Roman Britons there are trying to cobble together a defense and figure out how to deal with their challenges, and they want to keep Roman civilization going, okay? And so they've got these different groups attacking from different sides, and what they end up settling on as a way of defending themselves is hiring mercenaries. And what they do is they hire mercenaries from among the very group that's attacking them, okay? So we've already talked about the Saxons, but there are three different racial groups traditionally that are part of this attack on Britain: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, okay? And the Jutes come from what we now call Jutland, which is Denmark. So the British think, well, the best way to catch a thief is to set a thief, okay? Use a thief to catch a thief. So they hire some of these Anglo-Saxons, if you will, to be their mercenaries. And that works for a very short time before the mercenaries figure out we could make a lot more money by just taking over this island, okay? So they revolt against the British. And so basically during the 400s, what we've got happening is the Anglo-Saxons overrunning the island of Britain, okay? And it's about the year 500 that the advance of the Anglo-Saxons is checked. they are stopped in their tracks at a battle at a place called Baden Hill, which we don't know exactly where that is, but it's probably out in the west of Britain somewhere. And this could be the semi-legendary King Arthur, okay? If Arthur lived, this is probably when he lived. He could have been the guy who figured out how to check the advance of the Anglo-Saxons. And we know that for about 30 years, for about a generation, the Anglo-Saxon advance was checked. There was kind of a uneasy peace between the native Britons and the Anglo-Saxons, and then the conquest resumed starting in about 530 AD. And what happens is you get kind of what we call the Celtic fringe. The south and the east of Britain becomes occupied by the Germanic Anglo-Saxons, but the native Britons who were Celtic get shoved into Wales and Cornwall, and some of them actually leave Britain altogether and they go down to this little peninsula in Europe, which is now called Brittany, named for the Britons who fled the Anglo-Saxons and settled there, okay? So now we cut to 600 AD. It's been about 200 years since the Anglo-Saxon invasions began. The Anglo-Saxons have taken over the whole eastern part of the island, and they have formed themselves into essentially 7 little kingdoms. This is the traditional view. It's called the heptarchy, the rule of 7, okay? So you've got these different little kingdoms, and there's always one guy who has to be the toughest guy among all of the English, and they call this guy the Bretwalda, the over-king. Now, he doesn't literally rule all of the other kingdoms. You got to think about this like, again, he's the toughest guy on the block. He makes the other kingdoms maybe pay him tribute, okay? If nothing else, to recognize that he's the top dog at this particular time. And it kind of fluctuates over time which king of which little kingdom is the Bretwalda for some period of time, okay? But during this period, what we have is constant warfare among these little English kingdoms. They're constantly fighting themselves, but they're also constantly fighting with the other people on the island of Britain. They're constantly fighting with the Welsh and the Cornish and the Scots or the Picts, okay? So it's a constant ferment of warfare, and it's not just the Anglo-Saxons against the British, it's the Anglo-Saxons against themselves as well as against the British. So what do we know about Anglo-Saxon religion? Well, they were definitely pagan, okay? They had not been converted to Christianity at all, and they had essentially obliterated most of the Christianity that existed in the parts of Britain that they conquered, right? But they worship essentially the same gods that the Vikings worship, okay? So they've got the god Tyr, we talked about Tyr, Woden, Thor, sometimes called Thunor, Freya, okay? They've got other gods. We're going to talk about one in just a second here. Their calendar is slightly different than ours. They begin their year on December 25th, and the first month of their year was called Yule, okay? So we now have Yule logs, right? That goes back to the Anglo-Saxons. And as I said in church on Sunday, their 4th month, what we call April, was called Estra-Manath. And it was named for a goddess named Estra. And that gives us the name for our most important Christian holiday, traces back to this Anglo-Saxon goddess. Now, we don't know hardly anything about Estra. There's really only one mention of her. And the assumption is that she was probably like a fertility goddess, maybe a goddess of the dawn, okay? But in any event, we know that her festivals took place during the 4th month. So how did we end up with our Christian Feast of the Resurrection being named for this pagan goddess, okay? That's really what we're going to talk about tonight. I mean, if you think about that, blows your mind, doesn't it? The most important holiday in the Christian calendar named for a pagan goddess. So as I said, the English had basically, they rejected Christianity or never had heard it. And the British hated the Anglo-Saxons. They literally felt like you can go to hell. They made no attempt to convert the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity, okay? And one of the writers, really our only source for everything that happens during the 500s, is a British writer named Gildas. And he spends most of his time criticizing the British kings for being, insufficiently pious, and he blames them, their lack of piety, for all the evils that have befallen Britain. But in there, he basically says the English are not worth saving, okay? And on the flip side, the English themselves, the Anglo-Saxons, are this totally self-confident culture. And they don't want to incorporate or adopt anything of this weaker people that they have conquered, okay? We know that they intermarry with the British that they've conquered. Some of them they kind of shoved to the west, but some of the British they enslaved and, intermarried with. But even so, in the ancient English language, there are no words that come from the ancient British language, or maybe 1 or 2 words. It's like the English completely look down on the British to the point that they're not going to adopt one speck of British culture. It's our way is the best way, and we're keeping it. And with that is religion. So how do we get the English to be Christian? Well, we can thank the Pope in Rome, Pope Gregory the Great, one of the most fascinating figures in church history, one of the good popes, not just Pope Gregory the Great. He's a really good guy. And I'm going to do a class on the rise of the papacy, and we'll talk more about Pope Gregory in that class. But before Pope Gregory became Pope, he was living in Rome, and he was walking down the streets of Rome, and he goes by the slave market, and he sees in the slave market these young boys who have platinum blonde hair and bright blue eyes. And this just sticks out to him, right? Because he's from Italy. People there are darker hair, darker skin, dark eyes, platinum haired, blue-eyed boys. Who are these people? So he asks, who are these kids? They look amazing to me. And somebody tells him, they're Angles. They're of the race of Angles. And Gregory, being as bad at puns as I am, says, well, they look like angels to me. And it sticks in his mind that there's this beautiful race of people, and he finds out this is the group that has taken over the former Roman province of Britain. And Gregory, who's not yet Pope, says, I want to lead a mission to Britain to convert these amazing people to Christianity, these beautiful people to Christianity. But as we're going to see in a minute, Gregory is way too important to the church in Rome. And the Pope says, no way, I can't spare you. I'm not letting you leave here to go convert the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. But Gregory eventually becomes Pope, and he's never forgotten about the Anglo-Saxons. So when he becomes Pope, he decides he's going to sponsor that mission to the Anglo-Saxons. It's something that he's nursed as his kind of pet project for many years. So let's talk a little bit about Pope Gregory, because you got to understand his background to understand why the conversion goes the way it goes, okay? Gregory came from a very wealthy family, very noble family. His father was a high-ranking member of the Roman government. When Gregory comes of age, he's made prefect of Rome, which is basically the mayor of Rome, okay? Highest office you can have, short of being, emperor or something like that, but in the city of Rome, right, that is the top position. So his father had been that, he holds that himself. And he's an extremely capable guy. He does a great job running the government, but he doesn't really want to be the prefect of Rome. And as soon as his father dies, he says, I'm going to sell all the vast estates that my family owns and donate them to the church. I'm going to endow a monastery, and I'm going to live the rest of my life as a monk. So he becomes a monk, but his skills are such that the Pope, realizing what an asset he's got now in the church, in this guy Gregory, the Pope says, you don't get to live, as a monk the way you want to, kind of withdrawn from the world. I need you to help run the church. So he basically orders Gregory to be his number 2 in the papacy. And when that Pope dies, Gregory is elected Pope by acclamation. Everybody in the city says, we know exactly who the next Pope needs to be. We don't need to take a vote. Everybody raise your hand if you think Gregory's the guy, and everybody raises their hand. So he becomes Pope. But the things you got to understand about Gregory, given his background, right? He knows how the world works, okay? He is not, some ivory tower priest or monk who's never really lived in the world. He knows how things work. And we're going to see how that translates into the conversion of the English. So Gregory has it in his mind that he wants to send this mission to convert the Anglo-Saxons. And so he gets all the information he can about Roman Britain. He knows that it used to be a Roman province some 200 years ago, all right? And he knows that there are still some Christians there, right? He also knows, after doing some investigating, that the current Bretwalda, right, the toughest king on the block, the current Bretwalda happens to live in the kingdom of Kent. He's the king of Kent, which is down there in the southeastern corner of Britain. And that this guy is married to a Christian woman. He has married a Frankish princess from the former province of Gaul, the kingdom of the Franks, who are Christians. She had brought her own bishop with her. That was one of the conditions of the marriage. But Gregory's thinking, okay, we've got a tiny toehold here, right? We have at least one Christian there, and we've got a king who's married to that Christian. He might be amenable to letting my missionaries do their work. And this Frankish princess and her bishop have kind of set up shop. They've taken an old Roman church that had been abandoned, and they've reconsecrated it, and they're using it for her and whatever people she brought with her that are also Christian. This tiny little Christian community among the English. So now Gregory has to figure out, who am I going to entrust this mission to? And he finds a monk named Augustine. Says, you are going to be the missionary to the English. And Augustine has spent his life, his career, as the prior of a monastery, the head of a monastery, okay? He has a strong knowledge of scripture, and Gregory says, find 40 guys to help you in this mission, okay? So as we're going to see, Augustine is not real keen on this idea, okay? He did not step up and volunteer. He was voluntold by Gregory. It's going to become clear that that's the case. But he finds his 40 fellow missionaries, and they set out from Rome. They cross the Alps and they get into barbarian Gaul, the land of the Franks. And as soon as they are across the Alps and out of civilization, out of Italy, and they see what barbarian life is like, they're like, I don't think Gregory knows what he's doing by sending us here. And they send one of their guys back to Rome to say, Gregory, we think you've made a mistake. Can we call this whole thing off? Okay. And of course, Gregory tells this guy to suck it up, get back up there, tell the party to move on. Okay. Continue with your mission. And while they're among the Franks who had intercourse with the Anglo-Saxons to the point that they've got a royal marriage arranged, right? They provide some interpreters, some people who speak the English language, the ancient English language. So the party lands in the extreme southeastern corner of Britain. Let me minimize this. On what is called the Isle of Thanet, okay? And I know it's hard for you out in Zoom land to see it, but look down right across from Calais, the place where Britain is closest to Europe, and you'll see the Isle of Thanet. It's right there on the extreme eastern edge. And it's called the Isle of Thanet, but it's not truly an island. It's an estuarial island, meaning that when the tide is out, it is an island, or it's actually, when the tide is out, it's connected to the mainland. When the tide is high, then it's cut off from the mainland, okay? So they land on this little isle and send word to the King of Kent, a guy named Ethelbert, that they have arrived and they would like to meet with him. So Ethelbert gets word that this party has landed on the Isle of Thanet, and they're Christians. He knows a little bit about Christians because he's married to one, but he's not sure what to make of this. So he talks to his advisors and says to the missionaries, stay put till he should consider what to do with them, okay? Finally, after talking things over with his council, he says, okay, I will meet with them, but when we meet, it has to be out in the open air, because I don't want them enchanting me with any of their magic arts inside of a building, okay? So it has to take place in the open air. So he's a very superstitious guy, okay? But he goes ahead and meets with them, and they impress him with the message that they convey, the Christian gospel, and their sincerity, okay? And so Ethelbert says, okay, you can set up shop here, preach the gospel, more power to you. If you can convert some people to Christianity, I'm fine with that. I'll even provide food and shelter for you, okay? So they set up shop in his capital city of Canterbury. And know anything about the Anglican Church? Okay, that is the head of the English Church, and it goes back to the very earliest days. Okay, the Archbishop of Canterbury, that's where it all began. Okay, they work out of that old Roman church that Ethelbert's Frankish queen has reconsecrated. And according to our source for this period, they live simply and they preach to the masses. And our source is an 8th century monk named Bede, the Venerable Bede. You might have heard of him. In his History of the English Church and People, or the Ecclesiastical History of the English, he says, several believed and were baptized, admiring the simplicity of their innocent life and the sweetness of their heavenly doctrine. So, Augustine and his crew are starting to see a little bit of success. And they start to see enough success that they write back to Pope Gregory with some practical questions about how do we go about this, right? Now that we're here and we're actually dealing with these pagans and their temples and their idols, how do we go about this conversion? And this is the letter, an excerpt from the letter that Gregory wrote to them. And this really is going to be the key to how this conversion is going to proceed and why we call the Feast of the Resurrection Easter. Gregory says, talking about the pagans, their temples ought not to be destroyed, but only the idols in them. So if you convert some pagans, don't burn down the temple, don't build a new church. Just clear the idols out of it. Sprinkle holy water in the temples. Erect altars and house relics in them, so that the English may continue to frequent their familiar resorts. So, we come into Mountain View United Methodist. We clear out all the Christian paraphernalia. We sprinkle some pagan holy water in here. We put a couple pagan idols. And now everybody coming to church on Sunday suddenly are pagans, okay? That's essentially what Gregory is saying. Make it comfortable for them. Don't change the service from 9:30 to 10:30, okay? Don't go from a traditional service to a contemporary service. Keep as much as you possibly can. And he goes on to say, and because they are accustomed to sacrifice oxen to their devils, meaning their gods, let some other solemnity be celebrated in its place. So if they have a holiday in the 4th month in honor of Estra, find some other holiday a Christian holiday that we can tell them that's what they're observing. For it is impossible to eradicate error all at once from obdurate minds. And he who wishes to climb a mountain does so one step at a time and not in a single leap. So Gregory is giving them the roadmap to making it easy for the Anglo-Saxons to convert to Christianity. You basically get to keep doing things the way you've been doing in the same places, same holidays, except now they have a Christian meaning. So it's kind of a brilliant strategy. It's definitely a pragmatic strategy, right? But what's the downside of this? What's the danger? How do you know the people celebrating Easter really understand what they're celebrating and really understand that it's a Christian holiday, right? And as we're going to see whether Gregory's approach was really successful. Well, initially, the first big success is that he gets King Ethelbert to convert, right? As Bede tells us, Ethelbert was impressed by their delightful promises, backed up by many miracles. And finally, he accepts baptism. And after the king is baptized and converts, many others soon follow, okay? The king doesn't compel anybody. Bede makes this clear, doesn't force anybody to convert to Christianity, but he only showed more affection to the believers, okay? So the guy who has the power to hand out all the favors shows more favor and affection to the Christians, okay? So we're probably going to see some conversions of convenience, shall we say. And after he converts, he provides additional material resources to the missionaries. So now Augustine has to organize a church. He's got enough Christians that he's got to worry about organizing the church. So he travels to France and he is consecrated there by 3 other bishops. That's how it works. A bishop has to be consecrated by at least 3 other bishops through the laying on of hands, right? And they transmit the power that is embodied in them and that they got from 3 other bishops, a chain going all the way back to the apostles. Apostolic succession. So Augustine becomes a bishop and he sends 2 of his monks to Rome to get guidance on a whole multitude of issues. Number 1, in their travels through northern Italy and through France, they've seen all kinds of different practices of the liturgy. And they ask Gregory, what are we to make of this? Should we worry about this? They ask, what should we do about strange marital practices that the English have? If a man dies, his brother has to marry his dead brother's widow. Is that okay? What is our relationship to the bishops in France and the other bishops on the island of Britain? And they ask really specific, strange questions like, if I have a sexy dream and I wake up, is it okay for me to go have mass that morning? Okay, so they are very thorough in the questions they're asking. Now, Pope Gregory writes back, he answers their questions, but he also lays out his plan for what the church in England should be like, based on what he knows things were like in Roman Britain. And he knows that in Roman Britain, the 2 most important cities were London and York. Okay, York is where Constantine the Great was proclaimed emperor, by the way. So he tells Augustine, yeah, you can set up shop in Canterbury for now, but eventually you're going to want to move your headquarters to London. We're going to have 2 archbishops in Britain, and under each of those archbishops, there will be 12 suffragan bishops. So a total of 24 plus London and York. And he tells Augustine, because you're my God, right? I sent you the bishops that are already there in Britain, the bishops that are administering to the Britons, the non-Anglo-Saxon inhabitants of the island. Those bishops are going to be subordinate to you. You can guess how the British are going to feel about that. So, Augustine calls a synod and invites the British bishops to come. And as we've seen, there's no love between the British and the Anglo-Saxons. They are not crazy about this idea. They hate the Anglo-Saxons, and they have their own traditions they're proud of, okay? Very recently, there's been the most important saint among the Welsh, the patron saint of Wales, Saint David, who is this ultra austere monk who, ate nothing but grass and water and, lived complete ascetic life. The Welsh loved this guy. And they actually, after his death, they have this legend that Saint David is going to come back, and under his banner, the British are finally going to expel the English from the island of Britain, okay? So they have not given up hope of kicking the English out of their island, even though the English have been there for 200 years now. So Augustine calls this synod, and the British bishops kind of get together and whisper, and they say, well, let's give him a test, okay? When we walk into the church and he's sitting there, if he rises to greet us like equals, then we'll work with him. But if he stays seated and acts like he's Mr. Important and better than us, then we walk out. We don't cooperate. So he's sitting there, they walk in, and Augustine, being not too sensitive to what's going on, stays seated. He's been told by Gregory that he's in charge, and he alienates the British bishops right off the bat. So they have this synod, but the British have already decided they're not going to work with Augustine, okay? And they're trying to work out some liturgical and substantive differences. The British celebrate Easter at a different time than the Roman Church does, right? That's going to be a problem. You know that the Greek Orthodox Church still celebrates Easter at a different time than they're celebrating it next month in May. So back then, same thing was happening even within Western Christendom. And they have a different practice regarding baptism, but we don't know what the difference is, okay? So Gregory is trying to impose uniformity, and the British don't want to go along. The other thing church does is it sets about civilizing the English, okay? And this is one of my favorite parts of this class, okay? Ethelbert writes a law code, according to Bede, after the Roman model. We're going to write down our laws, something the English have never done before. A huge step forward for civilization, right? When something is written down, right? It's easy to point to and say, that's the rule. It's right there in writing. When it's all oral, right? Oh, that's not how I remember it, right? I remember the rule being this other thing. So writing down your laws, major step forward for civilization. And it's the church that brings that to the English. And in fact, Ethelbert's Law Code is the oldest document we have in the English language. The first law in Ethelbert's Law Code says, theft of God's property shall be compensated 12-fold. Okay? So the church are the guys writing this down. They make sure they get their bit included, and it's right off the bat. If you steal $100 from the church, the fine is $1,200. More importantly, they end what is called the blood feud. So among the Anglo-Saxons, the way that they basically kept peace with each other was through this practice called the blood feud, meaning if you kill a member of my family, I am obligated to kill you. And that's how people are protected, because their family will take vengeance. And the church says that makes for a very violent, chaotic society, you know, because where does it stop, right? So they get the English to go with this alternative approach called weregild, which literally translates as man price. So every person, depending on his rank, is assigned a dollar value. And if you kill somebody, you can atone for that by paying his family the amount of his weregild, rather than them being obliged to come and kill you. So it's a step forward in civilizing society. And then they go on in this law code to assign monetary values to a whole bunch of different things. So here's one codicil from Ethelbert's Law Code. If a man lies with a maiden belonging to the king, meaning a slave girl, he shall pay 50 shillings compensation. If she's a grinding slave, in other words, a less valuable slave, he shall pay 25 shillings compensation. Okay, so we've got something like the weregild for the slaves. If a man is the first to make forcible entry into another man's abode, he shall pay 6 shillings compensation. He who comes next shall pay 3 shillings. So if Rob and I barge into somebody's house, as is our wont, right? If I'm the first one through the door, I have to pay twice the fine that Rob does. There are various penalties for different violent acts you can commit. If you grab somebody's hair, that's basically 50 cents of a fine. If you disable their shoulder, 30 shillings. If you cause them to lose hearing, that's 25 shillings. If you cut off their ear, it's 12 shillings. If you knock out their eye, 50 shillings. If you disfigure their mouth, 12 shillings. And if you smash their chin, 20 shillings. So we've got a pretty good inventory of, disfigurements that you can cause and what it costs. Each of the fingers, each of the 5 fingers gets its valuation in Ethelbert's Law Code. The thumb, the most valuable, 20 shillings. If you just take off the thumbnail, that's only 3 shillings, okay? The index finger is 9, the middle finger is 4, the ring finger is 6, and for some reason, the pinky is the most valuable of the 4 fingers, 11 shillings. But this is my favorite. The generative organ. If you damage another man's generative organ, the price is 3 times his weregild, 3 times as much as if you kill him. Okay? All right, so the church is expanding, they're civilizing the English. They get enough Christians that they're able to found a second diocese in the city of Rochester. And then Ethelbert's son-in-law, the king of the East Saxons, Essex, okay, right next door to Kent, he convinces his nephew and underling, King Sabert, to convert to Christianity, and now we get a bishop in London. So things are going well, okay? Augustine himself dies in 609, and then in 616, both of the Christian kings, Ethelbert and Sabert, die. And remember, the mission was sent in 597, so it's been almost 20 years that we've had Christianity, and you would think it's probably taken hold by this point, but what happens is that Ethelbert's son Edbald succeeds him and marries his stepmother, which is a big scandal. And the Christian church tells him as much. And so Edbald renounces Christianity. And when the king is no longer Christian, Bede tells us that many followed him who had converted, quote, to gain favor from or out of fear of displeasing King Ethelbert. So a lot of those people who had converted just because Ethelbert did, now they go the other way. Edbald, we are told, is punished with fits of madness because he has apostatized. Up in Essex, King Sabert's son, King Sabert is succeeded by 3 sons, and they also revert to paganism. And when they go to the Bishop of London and they said, we want some of that good bread you give the Christians when you celebrate communion, the bishop says, no, I'm not giving that to you. They kick him out. So now Christianity is on the brink after almost 20 years. The bishops of London and Rochester are under such pressure that they actually flee Britain altogether. They go to France. And the Archbishop of Canterbury is getting ready to flee when he has a dream in which St. Peter appears to him and lashes him, whips him. And he wakes up and he's got the stigmata. He's got the marks from the lashes. And so he goes and he shows Edbald, I had this dream. Look, St. Peter literally whipped me in my sleep. And according to Bede, King Edbald is so moved by this that he divorces his wife, his stepmother, and is baptized. Now we have other sources that tell us that King Edbald, about this same time, had married a Frankish woman, and that's probably the real motive for his conversion. It was probably a condition of the marriage that he become Christian like his father had been, right? If you want to have good trade with the Franks, you're going to convert to Christianity. So King Edbald recalls the exiled bishops, and Christianity comes back from the brink. And up in Essex, the 3 sons of Sabert, the ones who had demanded the good white bread, they die in battle, but the people of Essex remain pagan. So we've got 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And it's a slow process, but it kind of goes to show that Gregory's strategy for converting the English probably kind of gave us a mile wide and an inch deep. We had this veneer of Christianity, but at the first sign of trouble, the people lapse back into paganism. But as we're going to see, Gregory's playing the long game. He figures, yeah, the first generation, probably not going to be heart and soul Christians, but the second, the third, once it becomes a habit, once you've heard the preacher telling you about Christianity every Sunday, you're actually going to eventually become Christian. And that is Pope Gregory's strategy. So next week, we will look at the expansion of Christianity in the island and what happens when Christianity from Rome, Augustine and his crew, runs into some missionaries from Ireland, bringing a very different kind of Christianity, and who's going to win out in that battle. So that's all I've got for tonight. Any questions about what I covered before I turn you loose for the week? Yeah, Rob.
Being the first one in,
Yep.
that need to, polite the whole.
Good question. Rob asked whether that's where we get our practice of holding the door for somebody. I doubt that's the case. Any other questions? All right, well, I hope you enjoyed tonight's class. We'll pick it up next week.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Mike.
you.
Mike, thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good evening.